Daniel and I got married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. I didn't care about a big wedding or showing off. I just wanted peace, a home, and a partner I could trust. For the first few weeks, things were calm. But the moment his parents became part of our daily life, everything changed. Patricia always found a way to remind me that she didn't think I was good enough for her son. She'd say things like, "Daniel could have married a woman with a real career," or "Some wives actually contribute." She never said it in a joking way, she meant it. Howard didn't talk much, but when he did, it was usually something dismissive. If I made dinner, he'd ask, "Did you learn this on YouTube since you don't have a job?" If I cleaned, he'd comment, "At least you're useful somewhere." I wasn't lazy. I chose to stay home because I managed things quietly in the background, paperwork, bills, and family planning. But they never cared to know anything about me or what I handled. One Saturday, Patricia came over unannounced while Daniel was out. She walked around my house like she owned it. She didn't even sit down before she started criticizing. She said the curtains looked cheap, the counters needed a real woman's touch, and the laundry room was embarrassing for a family like theirs. She made it sound like everything around me was borrowed from Daniel's hard work. She even asked, "Do you ever think about getting off the couch and earning something?" I didn't bother explaining that I paid most of the bills she thought Daniel covered. I wasn't interested in proving anything to people who already decided who I was. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was how normal they acted while saying them. They spoke to me like I was staff in their home instead of a person with a name and a life. When Daniel tried to step in once, Patricia laughed and said, "We're just being honest. She's not sensitive, is she?" At family dinners, they didn't hide it. If someone asked about me, Patricia would answer before I spoke. "Emily stays home. She takes care of the house. Daniel handles everything important." Then she'd smile like she'd said something sweet. I'd sit there, quiet, because arguing with people like that only feeds them. Daniel didn't always know what to do. He'd apologize in private, saying they just grew up old-fashioned. I told him I didn't care about old-fashioned. I cared about respect. But even then, I stayed calm. I wasn't going to lose my voice over two people who thought staying home meant being empty. What they never understood was that I wasn't quiet because I was weak or embarrassed. I was quiet because I didn't need their approval. They assumed silence meant I had nothing. They assumed not flaunting anything meant I owned nothing. They believed that because I didn't speak up, I couldn't stand on my own. They saw me cooking, cleaning, and staying peaceful. What they didn't see were the keys, contracts, and documents with my name on them. They had no idea that the woman they mocked was the one keeping their lives comfortable without ever saying a word. And I let them keep talking, because sooner or Patricia's comments didn't come once in a while. They became part of everyday life. If she called the house and I answered, she didn't even say hello. She'd say, "Is the maid free or is she scrubbing floors?" Once, when I brought coffee to the table during a visit, she smirked and said, "See? You don't even need to hire help when you've got one wearing a wedding band." Howard didn't bother hiding his thoughts either. One evening, Daniel and I went to his parents' house for dinner. While I was setting the plates, Howard nudged Daniel and said, "You really married down, son. But at least she cooks." He said it in front of his sister and brother-in-law like it was a casual observation, not an insult. No one reacted. They were used to it. They treated me like I was part of the furniture. If they needed groceries, I was expected to go. If someone was sick, I was the one making soup and cleaning up after. When holidays came around, nobody asked if I was willing to host. They just assumed I would. I'd be up cooking for hours while they sat in the living room talking about people who don't understand hard work. They believed every bit of comfort in that family came from Daniel. They spoke as if I was brought into a life I didn't deserve. They had no idea that most of what they used or stepped into had my name on the paperwork. They'd walk into one of my rental homes and talk about how Daniel must be doing well. I would just let them believe it. Their comments weren't loud or dramatic. They were casual jabs repeated, so often they sounded rehearsed. If I bought something new for the house, Patricia would ask if Daniel gave me money for it. If I went out alone, she'd call Daniel and ask who was watching the place while I wandered around town. Howard once asked if I ever felt guilty not contributing. He said it like he was curious, not cruel. Then he added, "Daniel will always take care of you. Just don't take advantage." I didn't answer. People like him don't actually want answers. Even during family gatherings, they made sure I stayed in the background. I'd cook, serve, and clean while they laughed about women who think being at home makes them important. They didn't think twice before saying it in front of me. I never bragged about my life before marrying Daniel. I never mentioned the businesses I signed off on, or the tenants who mailed checks to a company name they'd never heard his parents speak of. I handled everything quietly, and they assumed quiet meant powerless. Daniel tried a few times to tell them to stop, but they brushed him off. Patricia claimed she was just joking, and Howard said, "If she can't handle a comment, that's on her." They were so sure of the picture they painted of me that they never asked a single real question. Every month, money came in from places they didn't know I owned. Every decision they believed Daniel made alone was backed by something tied to me. While they joked about how I didn't have a real job, I signed off on projects and tenant contracts they relied on without realizing it. They thought they were putting me in my place. What they didn't know was that I had built the ground they were standing on. Later, reality always introduces itself without an invitation. Long before I took Daniel's last name, I made sure everything I inherited stayed protected. My grandfather left me properties, several vehicles, and a construction company he built from scratch. He always told me, protect what's yours, even from the people closest to you. I listened. With the help of an attorney, I created an LLC under my maiden name, Emily Carter. Every house, every car, every business account, every contract was transferred there. Nothing was in my married name, nothing tied to Daniel, nothing his family could claim or control. When Daniel and I got engaged, I was honest with him. I showed him everything. I explained where the money came from and what my responsibilities were. He knew about the tenants, the employees, the maintenance teams, and the income the business generated. I told him I didn't want it mixed with our marriage in case anything went wrong. He agreed and signed a prenup without hesitation. His exact words were, "It's yours, I respect that." But his parents never asked about my life before I married him. Patricia assumed I came from some average family with nothing to my name. Howard thought Daniel rescued me by marrying someone who stayed home. They told people at church and around town that their son was the reason I had a roof over my head. They'd introduce us and say things like, "This is Emily. Daniel takes good care of her." Or, "She's lucky he's such a provider." They never once wondered where the cars came from or who paid the taxes on the house they visited. Daniel never corrected them because he didn't want to start pointless arguments. He believed, at some point, they'd realize they were wrong. They never did. They loved showing off on his behalf. At family barbecues, Patricia would brag that Daniel handled all the bills. When someone complimented the house, Howard would say, "Daniel worked hard for it." I would hear them and stay silent. I didn't need their approval or acknowledgement. I knew what was mine, and I knew they were living in a story they wrote themselves. Patricia even once told her friend, right in front of me, Emily's family didn't have much, but she married into stability. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I let her feel secure in that lie. They assumed what they wanted to believe because it made them feel superior. They pictured me as someone who got lucky, someone who depended on their son to survive. They had no clue that the vehicles they rode in, the vacation home they once stayed at, the insurance Daniel used, and the job he later landed were all connected to companies under my management. Their ignorance wasn't my problem. Their arrogance kept them blind. I didn't correct them because I didn't owe them an explanation. All they ever did was talk down to me. And the more they underestimated me, the quieter I stayed. They thought they understood our marriage, our finances, and our roles. What they didn't understand was that I didn't need to prove myself to people who were already convinced I was beneath them. And I knew one day, when a storm hit their neighborhood, Patricia and Howard's house took the worst of it. The roof leaked, the basement flooded, and parts of the walls buckled. They didn't want anyone to know they couldn't afford the repairs. Instead of filing proper claims or paying contractors, they called Daniel in private and said they just needed a place for a few weeks. Daniel didn't ask me first. He came home and said, "They're going to stay in one of the rentals until their house is fixed." He thought it would only be temporary. I didn't argue. I just asked which property he gave them, and he pointed to one of the 3-bedroom homes I managed through the LLC. Patricia and Howard moved in the next day. They never asked whose name was on the lease or who paid the taxes. They assumed Daniel was doing them a favor with his own money. They walked around that house like they were entitled to it. The house was fully furnished, clean, and well-maintained. Patricia acted like Daniel must have stretched himself thin to help his parents in a crisis. She didn't even say thank you. Instead, she said, "Good thing Daniel has his finances in order." Not everyone could take in family this suddenly. They didn't know the mortgage was paid through the rental company every month without breaking a sweat. They didn't know the electric, water, and insurance were automatically covered from the income of 3 other properties. Every cost tied to that house was handled by accounts they had no idea existed. When the utility company sent mail to the house with my maiden name on it, Patricia handed it to Daniel and said, "Tell the landlord to use your address instead. This isn't ours to deal with." She didn't even read the name. She just assumed Daniel was renting from someone else on their behalf. Howard complained about the stove, the paint in one room, and the lawn needing trimming. He acted like a guest who expected hotel treatment. I scheduled repairs and maintenance without mentioning that it came from my budget and my employees. They told relatives that Daniel found them a place and was helping cover costs until insurance paid out. They never asked how it was possible. They just believed he handled everything, because that version of the story made sense to them. Daniel apologized later for not asking me before moving them in, but I told him it was fine. I wasn't worried about the money. I was watching how they behaved when they were the ones in need. They stayed longer than planned. Weeks turned into months. Their house repairs stalled because they didn't have enough saved. But they still looked at me like I was a burden and spoke to me like I was living off their son. They moved into my property, slept under my roof, used the appliances I bought, and cooked with utilities I paid for. And they never once stopped to wonder how Daniel pulled it off so easily. They thought they were being helped by him. What they never realized was that I was the one keeping them comfortable without saying a word. Silence would speak louder than anything I could ever say. Dinner at their house was always the same. Patricia gave orders, Howard made comments, and everyone else pretended it was normal. That night, they'd invited a few relatives over. I cooked most of the meal, even though it wasn't my home. By the time everyone sat down, I was already tired, but I kept quiet like I always did. The conversation started harmless, small talk about work, kids, and the weather. Then someone mentioned how their daughter-in-law had gone back to school to be more useful. That was all Patricia needed to jump in. She looked down the table at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some women contribute to a marriage. Others just fold laundry and hope no one notices their dead weight." A few people looked at me, waiting to see how I'd react. I didn't say a word. I kept my face calm even though my chest tightened. I'd heard her talk like that before, but not in front of so many people. Howard didn't stay quiet either. He leaned back in his chair, smirking like he was sharing wisdom. "Truth is," he said, "if Daniel ever left, she'd have nothing. That's the problem with depending on a man. Once he walks away, so does your life." People at the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one corrected him. Patricia nodded like he'd said something wise. Daniel looked embarrassed, but froze like he didn't know whether to speak up or pretend he hadn't heard. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them about the LLC, the houses, or the company I own. I didn't remind them they were sitting in one of my properties or eating food bought from my accounts. I just sat there, quiet. But the words didn't hurt because they were true. They hurt because they were blind lies spoken with full confidence. They believed I was living off their son. They believed I was disposable. They believed I was scared of being alone. I took a deep breath, placed my fork down, and excused myself from the table. I walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and stood there in silence. I didn't cry from shame. I cried from disbelief that people could be this cruel while standing on ground they didn't even own. I splashed water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. I reminded myself that silence didn't make me weak. It made them ignorant. After a few minutes, I went back out to the living room and sat quietly on the couch while everyone finished eating. No one asked if I was okay. No one apologized. They just went on with their conversations as if nothing had happened. But something had changed for me. It wasn't about being polite anymore. It wasn't about keeping the peace. They had crossed a line they couldn't walk back from. I wasn't angry. I was done. They thought they were cutting me down. They had no idea they were talking about someone who could take away every comfort they had without raising her voice. Their words didn't break me. They marked the moment. When Daniel lost his job, it happened fast. One morning he went to work like normal, and by the afternoon he was packing his things into a box. The company was downsizing, and his position was cut. He came home quiet, holding the box like it weighed 100 pounds. I didn't panic. I just told him we'd figure it out. But his parents acted like it was nothing serious. Patricia said, "Well, at least Emily has you to rely on." Howard nodded and added, "She'll be fine as long as you're around. Some women can't survive on their own." They still believed Daniel was paying for everything, the house, the cars, the insurance, even groceries. They never once asked how bills were being handled. They assumed because he wore a suit to work and I stayed home, that he carried the full load. They visited one afternoon shortly after he lost his job. Patricia walked through the house, looking around like she was inspecting something she owned. She made a comment under her breath. "Good thing Daniel bought this place before things got tight." I heard it, but I didn't correct her. I had no interest in handing them the truth yet. A week later, Daniel's insurance through his job ended. I already had coverage set up through one of my companies, so nothing changed for us. He didn't even have to make a call. The cards came in the mail like always, with the same provider and same doctors attached. His parents didn't notice anything. Why would they? They were busy assuming. Patricia loved to talk about things she didn't understand. At church, she told a group of women, Daniel bought a beautiful home for them. Emily keeps it tidy, which is good since she doesn't bring an income. She said it like she was proud of him and disappointed in me at the same time. One of the women asked if I ever planned on working. Patricia didn't miss a beat. She answered for me. She doesn't have to. Daniel provides. He takes care of everything. She said it as if it were a proven fact. Meanwhile, Daniel was home updating his resume on a laptop I purchased, sitting in a house I owned, drinking coffee made in a kitchen I paid for. When his parents stopped by again, they asked him if unemployment checks would be enough to cover both of you. Daniel opened his mouth to explain, then closed it again. He looked at me and stayed quiet. They had no clue the mortgage was drafted from one of my business accounts every month. They had no clue the cars in our driveway were registered under the LLC. They had no clue the taxes and repairs were handled by people who reported to me. They kept talking like I was lucky Daniel hadn't left me stranded. They didn't realize he was the one standing on ground I had laid before he ever met me. I didn't argue with them. I didn't correct a single word. I let them keep telling their version because the truth was going to show itself soon enough. And when it did, it wouldn't need an introduction. Stopped giving them space in a life they thought they controlled. Not long after Daniel lost his job, his parents started worrying more about themselves than anything else. They were still living in the rental house I provided, acting like it was temporary, even though months had passed. Howard came over one afternoon and asked Daniel to make things official with the property. He said they wanted the house put in Daniel's name for security. He tried to sound polite, but the message was clear. They wanted ownership without paying for it. Patricia sat beside him with her usual smug look, like she expected it to happen without question. I was sitting at the table when Howard brought it up. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, I calmly said, "I'll check with the property manager and see what the process is." Patricia didn't even wait a full second before snapping. "Why? You don't make decisions in this family." She said it like I was interrupting something above my level. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, as if my voice didn't matter. Daniel tried to smooth things over, but the damage was already done. They still thought they were dealing with someone who had no control over anything. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I just nodded and ended the conversation. They left the house without a clue of what was coming. That night, after dinner, I sat down with my laptop and logged into the LLC accounts. First, I reviewed the rental agreements. The house Patricia and Howard were living in was still under tenant use access for family convenience, something I had allowed out of courtesy. I removed that access completely. Then I checked the vehicles. Daniel and his parents had been using 2 cars registered under my company, one SUV and one sedan. Both were still listed under family use. I updated the records and pulled all shared permissions. Daniel would no longer have authority to hand anything over or sign off on changes. I contacted the attorney who handled my assets and asked him to update the access list to reflect that only I had decision-making rights. Within a few hours, everything was reset. No one but me could approve occupancy, transfers, or title adjustments. I didn't tell Daniel that night. There was nothing to argue about, nothing to debate. His parents had pushed too far, and they were about to learn who actually held the keys to everything they were leaning on. By the time I closed the laptop, the house they were living in, the vehicles they used, and every contract tied to those things were fully under my control with no loopholes left. They thought I was just the woman who cooked and cleaned. They never imagined I could take away every comfort they were using, all with a few quiet clicks. They wanted security. The next morning started quietly, but it didn't stay that way for long. Patricia and Howard were having breakfast in the rental house when a courier knocked on the door. He handed them an official envelope addressed to current occupants. Howard opened it right at the table. It was a notice to vacate the property within 30 days due to owner transition and reassignment. The letter didn't mention my name, but it came from the LLC. They didn't recognize it. Patricia immediately called Daniel, angry and confused. She said, "Why would your landlord do this now? Call them and fix it." Daniel looked at me, unsure how to respond. I didn't speak. I waited. Before he could make sense of that letter, more problems began piling up. First, the insurance cards Patricia and Howard used, cards they believed Daniel provided, were suddenly inactive. When Patricia tried to schedule a checkup, the clinic told her coverage was no longer valid. She called Daniel again, demanding answers. Then came the vehicles. The SUV Howard used for errands and Patricia used for appointments was collected from the driveway by a towing service working for the leasing branch tied to my LLC. It wasn't loud or dramatic. They just drove up, verified the plate, and loaded it. Patricia ran outside screaming, "You can't take our car!" But no one listened. They called Daniel for the 3rd time that morning. They were furious, saying everything was falling apart at once, and he needed to step up and be the provider. Daniel finally asked them to come to our house so we could talk in person. When they arrived, they were already complaining before the door closed. Patricia threw the vacate notice on the table and said, "You need to talk to the owner. We're not leaving, and we need the car back. That company has no right." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify anything. I simply reminded Daniel of the prenup he'd signed before we got married. The same one that clearly said he had no ownership, no claim, and no control over anything I inherited. He knew exactly what that meant. Patricia and Howard didn't. They were still arguing about the rental when Daniel finally said, quietly, "Everything you've been using belongs to her." They both froze. He didn't give details. He didn't have to. The realization hit them in pieces. The house they were being forced to leave was never his. The cars weren't his. The insurance wasn't his. Even the gas cards Howard used were tied to my company accounts. Patricia's face went pale. Howard didn't speak right away. They looked at me like I had tricked them, when all I had ever done was stay silent. Daniel didn't try to defend them or himself. He just sat there, stunned, remembering exactly what he had signed and what he had agreed to from day one. They finally understood something I had never needed to say out loud. Nothing in their hands was theirs, and none of it came from Daniel. Their comfort wasn't taken. It was returned to its real owner. We're about to find out who provided it in the first place. Patricia didn't wait to be invited. She came into the house yelling before the door even closed behind her. Her voice was sharp and shaking as she shouted that I had destroyed their stability and embarrassed their family. She said I had no right to take away what belonged to Daniel. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my tone. I walked to the dining table, opened a folder, and placed the documents in front of her one by one. The room went quiet except for the sound of paper sliding across the wood. There was the deed to the house she'd been bragging about. It showed the owner's name in clear print, my maiden name, not Daniel's. Next were the business registrations tied to the LLC, the same one responsible for the rental, the vehicles, and the insurance. Then came the account statements showing who had paid for the groceries, utilities, and fuel cards. I didn't make a speech. I didn't insult her. I only said what was necessary. You called me useless, but you've lived in my house, driven the cars I bought, and eaten food paid for by my work. Patricia stared at the documents like she was trying to find a mistake. She looked at the last name printed on everything and realized it wasn't Daniel's name anywhere. She wasn't looking at guesses or assumptions. She was looking at legal proof. Howard stood behind her, quiet and tense. When he saw the property title and the business papers, he stopped trying to speak on her behalf. His anger disappeared the moment he realized nothing they had touched was ever theirs to begin with. Patricia tried to deny it at first. She said Daniel must have signed something. She said the house was meant to be his because his parents believed it was. But every document in that stack showed otherwise. No joint ownership, no shared contract, no hidden transfer. Everything had been bought, managed, and registered under my own name and companies long before they inserted themselves into my life. Her voice dropped. She didn't apologize, but the fight went out of her. She wasn't angry at the situation. She was shocked that the picture she'd built in her head was never real. All the bragging at church, all the comments about me depending on their son, all the times she'd spoken about what they owned, none of it had been true. Howard didn't defend her or himself. His silence said more than anything he could have tried to explain. He finally understood why no one had asked for their permission, why no one needed their approval, and why their names were nowhere on anything they'd been using. I didn't tell them to leave. I didn't threaten them. I only gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. The truth was enough. Patricia had spent months calling me insignificant while standing on ground I paid for. Now she knew it. She walked out without another word. Howard followed her. The door shut behind them, and Emily didn't waste time arguing or explaining. After the confrontation, she met with her attorney and filed the proper paperwork to remove Patricia and Howard from the rental house. The notice was official and gave them a move-out date. There were no warnings, no extra chances, and no more access to anything tied to her business. Daniel, faced with the truth in black and white, didn't shout or try to defend his parents. He quietly packed his things and left on his own. He didn't move into another one of her properties. He rented a small apartment in his own name, something he hadn't done in years. The comfort he'd taken for granted was gone, and he knew he had no claim to get it back. The prenup he signed without a second thought now stood between him and everything he once assumed was his. Emily didn't celebrate their downfall. She didn't tell friends or post anything online. She didn't even correct the rumors Patricia tried to spread. Patricia went around telling people that Emily had trapped them or kicked them out without warning, trying to play the victim to anyone who would listen. But when a few of those people privately saw the documents, titles, business records, and ownership papers, they realized Patricia had been living off the woman she looked down on. No one argued on Patricia's behalf after that. Some simply stepped back. Others shook their heads at how blind she had been. Howard stopped talking altogether when people asked questions. The silence from him said more than excuses could. Emily didn't block their number or send angry messages. She let the legal process do everything. Locks were changed, access codes were updated, and all remaining accounts tied to her LLC were secured. She didn't need to raise her voice when signatures and filings spoke louder. Daniel tried to apologize, but not to win her back, just because he finally understood the damage done. Emily didn't respond with bitterness. She only reminded him that respect is shown in actions, not apologies made after comfort disappears. Patricia and Howard struggled to adjust. They had no property in their names, no vehicles to use, and no insurance coverage to fall back on. The same woman they mocked for depending on their son had been the one keeping their lives steady. Without her, they had to rely on what they actually owned, nothing. Emily returned to her routine, met with her property manager, and checked in with the company she inherited. Life didn't fall apart without them. It became quieter, lighter, and fully hers again. There were no dramatic speeches, no revenge plans step by step. She simply stopped giving them access to what never belonged to them in the first place. And in the end, the truth settled in one undeniable line. They didn't lose a helper. They lost their foundation. The first time, they saw me as the owner, not the outsider.